Thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I don't have my Finnish up to scratch because, I speak a lot of the imperialist languages, including Swedish, which I know had an imperialist relationship with Finland, but hopefully in the near future, I'll be able to throw more words. But hi, everyone. My name is Mika, and I'm sorry I can't join you in person, especially right now when Finland and Sweden are joining NATO and the various crises that are happening across the world. Thank you very much to the Women for Peace, as well as the Finland-Syria Friendship Society for organizing this. I think it's very important. And I hope that I can get some notes about what the agreements are at the end of your meeting, and we can see how we can coordinate the efforts between us. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the project of African sovereignty, because for many women organizing in the global South and in Africa in particular, one of the main challenges to how we organize against war, against conflict, is precisely because our countries are not sovereign, our projects are not sovereign, and African women in particular are struggling against various variables. But when we talk about war and conflict, the hidden ones, we often aren't talking about the structural issues. So I'm going to focus on the structural issues and how women are organizing in the networks I'm a part of, which I'm part of a group called Pan-Africanism Today, that is a regional coordination body of various trade unions, political parties of the left, social groups, advocacy groups, who basically are at minimum anti-imperialist in nature. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and please, you might have to shout at me if I speak too long, but it's only 20 minutes, so please let me know if I'm going, it's close to 5 minutes. So I'm just going to speak briefly about the context, the question of African sovereignty, the role of Western militarization, and people's resistance. And before I start the context, even though we're talking about, I think, war in a traditional sense, or conflict in terms of interregional or within a civil war context, I just wanted to mention, for those who are not aware, that we also have two levels of war and conflict that happen within many African countries. I'm sitting in South Africa right now, and violence within our country is extremely high. So there's also a hidden level of like physical and social violence that's happening within our African countries. And in South Africa, this is an image from a protest of the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa, which is one of my primary political directives comes from the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa. And this is a protest from 2018 against gender-based violence, because South Africa is one of the countries where we experience high levels of domestic violence and interpersonal physical violence, where our president a few years ago compared the levels of violence in South Africa as what you'd see in a war zone, with more than half of the women who were murdered in 2009 in South Africa, for example, were killed by an intimate partner, a male partner. And if you look at the statistics around gender-based violence, whether it's sexual or physical, every single woman in South Africa within their lifetime will have experienced, or at least 25%, to 40% of South African women would have experienced some form of physical violence or sexual violence. So there's an implicit violence within the society that normalizes, I think, conflict on a national, interregional, or continental level. And for those who are resisting it, who are, for example, the Shack Dwellers movement, this is a leader from the Shack Dwellers movement, Nokuthula Mabaso, who was killed earlier this year on the 5th of May. She worked in an organization that basically is 80,000 unhoused, landless people who have, in the last 15 years, been organizing to occupy land in order to, of course, have a space to recreate oneself. But women have been at the forefront of this organization precisely because women occupy the historical role of social reproduction and reproducing the home, the family, the basic unit of survival. And so we also have a situation, a widespread situation on the African continent where those who are organizing for basic human rights receive extreme levels of political repression and state violence. And this is across the continent where, for example, in Egypt, where they recently held the COP27, the femicide rates have been increasing there, and they have at least 60,000 political prisoners in prison, jailed currently, 60,000 in Egypt. So the question of, I just wanted to raise these small elements because if we're talking about hidden or silenced spaces in which women are leading struggles for liberation, for justice, for equality, within nation states, there's a level of societal violence and state violence that permeates the society and normalizes the deaths of women and people who stand up for change. Just basically, because I'm not sure, unfortunately, I can't see who all is in the room, but I just wanted to give a little bit of context about the African continent before I talk about some of the structural elements, is that, as you can see, we have a massive continent. You know, we're over 1.2 billion people across 54 countries. And, you know, we also have occupied regions such as Western Sahara of the Sahrawi people. As you can see from on the right, this other map, you can see that Africa is also a massive continent. Here, the brown is the United States of America, fits in most of West Africa. China fits in a lot of the central area. India fits in the Horn of Africa, and many of the European states like Spain, France, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, all fit within North Africa. And so I just wanted to share that for proportion, because I don't think people take it for granted how massive the African continent is, especially because it's was colonized by very small countries technically. And we also, of course, are faced with many issues of inequality, whether it's the fact that, 614 million Africans, which is, more than half of the, or almost half of the population, have no access to electricity. 1 in 3 Africans are faced with water scarcity. We have also over half of the population facing food insecurity, and as well as, I could say a myriad of deep social inequalities that prevent the African people from living in a humane way. But to just last little factor, because I wanted to give context, is that the African continent is in a situation in which the 22 richest men in the world have more combined wealth than all the 325 million African women. So there are 325 million African women, and they have less combined wealth than the 22 richest men in the world. And I think that figure has probably, this is from 2020, so it's probably gotten worse because of the pandemic and how we saw billionaires increasing their wealth. But I think this is important context, because this is the landscape in which we find ourselves confronted with social instability and unrest that leads to various conflicts. And I just wanted to quickly share some of the conflicts. This is a map, a partial map of the world. But as you can see, around the Horn of Africa, Central Africa, into the Sahel and North Africa, Mozambique, which is over here at the bottom, is not highlighted, but is also experiencing what we would consider to be like a form of a civil war. So there, as you can see, there is clearly various conflicts that are happening and that continue to be a massive challenge to how we try to exert and defend our sovereignty. And of course, this has gendered impacts that our women specifically feel, and I'm just going to briefly highlight them before I get into the main analysis I want to share, is that of course, gender-based violence is often weaponized and heightened in conflict or post-conflict situations. For example, in Liberia between 1989 to 2003, 60 to 70% of all women and girls in the country were raped. And we only have these statistics because this was almost, 20 years ago now, so they've been able to gather the evidence, but we can only imagine that these statistics are reflective in many other contexts across the continent. If we look at the question then of forced displacement, women experience, I think, a disproportionate burden when being displaced in the context that Africa has last year, 36 million people were forcibly displaced. And that's about 40% of global displacements that were happening last year. And of that, 75% are internally displaced people. And of course, this puts the burden on women because they are the primary laborers in the social reproduction of day-to-day life. Then, of course, this has an impact of lowering access to basic services, which we know in a very patriarchal societies that we find ourselves already, girl children have limited access to education, and in conflict areas or areas of war, this is dramatically reduced due to the fact that not only is infrastructure not available, like in Tigray last year, many of the conflict areas would base their military operations in schools. And of course, this then decreases the standard of living for women and girls. And just as last mention is, even though child marriages are sadly far too prevalent on the African continent that they should be, it worsens, of course, in war situations because the inability to feed and house and home your own children and to sustain your family opens up the option for marrying off girl children in order to survive. But the main thing I wanted to talk about and what at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, where I work, and with the movements I work with in the International People's Assembly within the Pan-African region, is that the challenges to Africa's sovereignty and peace are too often focused or attributed to the, how can I say this, to the effect rather than to the cause. A lot of the various UN resolutions, etc., are more focused on how do we stop terrorism or how do we stop migration, but not necessarily understanding what is the reason or what is the structural causes that reproduce the need for migration, that reproduce the emergence of terrorist groups. And for us, part of the work we do is we want to understand structurally how these things are reproduced. And that's how we produce or enter into relationships with other movements and organizations, whether they're trade unions, whether they're women's groups across the African continent. And so one of the things that we've been looking at closely and trying to share is, of course, the fact that Africa is home to 30% of the world's mineral resources, but Africa's historical inheritance of the colonial project and its various manifestations in the neo-colonial processes from the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc., have ensured that African states are reliant on exporting raw materials, which we have plenty of. This is just a map of some of the top minerals, which I'm sorry, you probably can't see from afar. But I mean, Africa is home to 98% of the world's chromium, 90% of cobalt, 90% of platinum, 70% of coltan, 50% of gold, a third of uranium, etc., etc. I could list them all. But African states have been unable to diversify their economies and build sovereign, independent projects due to the power of multinational corporations, due to the lack of sufficient industrialization, due to the continuance of various neo-colonial policies that has essentially put us in a position of dependency on foreign capital. And this condition of dependency has been structured around those old colonial policies. which essentially have, ensured that there can be greater avenues for manipulation by foreign governments of African interests, where our ruling governments basically will sell off our natural resources for their own personal benefit, where we've seen illicit financial flows of at least $1 trillion in the last 30, 40 years. And we've been essentially unable to leverage the mineral resources we have to better the lives of the African people. So when we are approaching the question of how women are organizing and mobilizing, if we don't understand the structural inheritance of colonialism in the current context and its continuation in imperialist policies, then we in our network feel that we won't be impactful in shifting the situation and avoiding the types of conflicts that have arisen due to the lack of social, economic, and political stability. And one of the contributors to this process has, of course, been the role of Western militaries, where this is an image from a study we did at Tricontinental on Western militaries. And these are some of the different bases of the 29 AFRICOM, the United States Africa Command foreign military permanent bases. They have about 29 permanent bases, but at least 60 access points across the African continent where they have performed, they say they're coming in to do, to assist with security concerns. But what we have found and what we know as the reality of the situation is that the US Africa military basically serves one gendarme function of trying to protect the commercial interests of the US, and two is occupying the African region, like the belt, especially across the Sahel, in order to have a stronghold in this kind of new Cold War that many African states don't want to be a part of, but that the US is nonetheless trying to push in order to sustain itself against its Eastern and, China and Russia, its opposition or its challenges. But essentially, the reason why I wanted to raise the US military is because, as many of you might know, where the US military or NATO in the form of the proxy of the US military has acted in Africa, it has not increased our security. In fact, if we look at the case of Libya, with the 2011 bombing that happened in Libya, it not only destroyed key infrastructure in a country that at the time had the highest human development index figures in Africa, but it also, of course, took the lives of many people and, in fact, increased the trade of arms, the rise of rogue militia groups that essentially have totally destabilized and destroyed the country and have allowed for the spread of extremist violence across the Sahel and West Africa and North Africa. And so when we as women are thinking about how we're going to organize this, we need to understand what the kind of imperialist actors are and how they continue to frame conflict as the cause and migration as the cause of social instability, when in fact it is this increase of military interventions in this region that have further deepened what was already the economic and structural violence and inequality that have plagued the African continent. And moving on to resistance, I'll just say that from the perspective, if we just even look at African nation states, which don't necessarily hold the interests of our people at heart, what we can see since the Ukraine war began, what is I don't want to say a positive, but one aspect of it that looks favorable for African people is the fact that a lot of African states have taken an attitude of non-alignment, where they don't want to be dragged into the wars of the US led campaign, as well as any kind of foreign military interventions that would negatively impact the African continent. And so we are trying to take advantage of the fact that there is a mood of non-alignment, where this is just showing a map of the African countries where at least half of African countries didn't go along with the initial declaration of the UN resolution, but also subsequent resolutions that have been put forward, such as sanctioning of Russia. Africans haven't wanted to taken a part of it because they don't want to be dragged into a foreign agenda that essentially doesn't serve them. But then if we look at people's resistance, of course, in the last, few decades, actually, we can talk about it in the last century, since the national liberation struggles began on the African continent, there have been various forms of direct action, many led by women. And this is an image of, in 2018, there was a protest in Ghana against the US, there was a US military deal for the US to basically use the international airport there as its own kind of military base of operations, even though it wasn't like a physical base. But there was massive protest and uprising against this foreign military base there. And various forms of direct action have been occurring across the continent through the movements. But the main one in the last, I think 10 years, we would say, is there's been a lot of people's resistance through building anti-imperialist organization and work between people's movements. So as I mentioned, I'm part of a coordination body called Pan-Africanism Today, where we are trying to interlink and intermingle the different interests of different social justice, progressive organizations across the continent, in order for us to see our destinies as much more interlinked. So we work with, the Socialist Party in Zambia, the Workers' Party in Tunisia, the shack dwellers movement in South Africa, the peasant movements in different parts of Southern Africa. And these groups all are fighting for important things that seem very different, but one of the main forms of our format of peace activism is to show various groups that their interests are interlinked, and that the peasant has interests with the worker, that the feminist has interests with the housing organizations, or the access to housing organizations. And so just lastly, because I think my time is up, is, for example, in Mozambique, there's a civil war in the north. And I was at a meeting a few months ago where many women who had gathered were not just women affected by the war directly, but were peasant organizations, fisher women organizations, single mother organizations. And what we're trying to do right now through education and exchange is to ensure that they understand that the war that's happening in the north of Mozambique, which is primarily due to the fact that a lot of young people are unemployed, don't have a good living situation, but live in a region that has, a lot of access to gas and natural mineral resources, but are basically subjugated to the interests of big multinationals like Exxon, Total from France. And we're trying to get these women to interact with, and you see the women on the left side, this is a Tanzanian peasant women's organizations of about 200,000 people. They're women and men, but mostly led by women. And we're trying to make sure that they come together through education projects, through exchange programs, so that we understand that the subjugation that is experienced across the continent, which leads to wars and conflicts, as we've seen in Mozambique and many parts of the continent, are not as a result of simply jihadist violence or simply of domestic actors, but it's part of a deeper structural project that survives on the inequality, the massive inequality between those who work and those who own and profit from the natural, human, and social resources of the African continent. I think I can stop there. Sorry, I was speaking very fast. I have so much I wanted to say.
Toivotko, että esittelen nyt?
Niin, tai siis, jos se voi puheenjohtaja keskustelua.
Niin, okei. Käy läpi näitä.
Joo. Hello, Mikaela. I am Taika from Artists for Peace in Finland. So if you have questions, I don't know if puhuuko kaikki täällä englantia? I was asking if everyone would speak English. No joo. Onko teillä, do you have questions for Mikaela about the presentation?
Zoomissa ei ole käsiä noussut.
Niin, aivan selkeä niille. And also in Zoom, if you have questions for Mikaela or comments, please be free. Okay, Ulla, go ahead.
Hello, Mikaela. I'm sorry. And to the audience, I'm sorry that I can't be with you. But as you can hear, I really have caught a terrible flu. But thank you, Mikaela. You are such a strong woman, and your arguments are also so strong. I wish we could see you at a big conference speaking in front of all these 22 rich men and all these bloody stupid leaders in the world. Mikaela, Lea, and I were all at the Madrid anti-NATO summit, the NGO summit, and marching with 30,000 people in the streets of Madrid against NATO. And Mikaela there had a real fantastic speech. But I would ask Mikaela, because here in Finland the situation seems so desperate with the NATO application and maybe getting US bases, although they say we don't get them, and all the money fleeting out. When Lea read the speech, I said in my opening notes, I couldn't be there, but Lea read them, that 3% of the United States military budget would take off the famine in the world. What shall we do? Do you see any hope?
I mean, the situation seems very hopeless in many levels. Many of you were watching or following the COP27, where, you know, Coca-Cola is sponsoring the climate conference. Meanwhile, Coca-Cola is one of the biggest, you know, polluters. It was in a context in which, you know, as I mentioned, Egypt has massive political repression of its own people, where like Allah Abdel Fattah, who is a political prisoner, he increased his hunger strike during that time, and it's falling on deaf ears in many ways. But what I will say is that another aspect of the COP, which I think is something of a form of inspiration, is Brazil has now emerged out of one of the worst leaderships it's had in many years. The election of Lula da Silva was largely possible due to the base movements of groups like the Brazilian movement, the Landless Workers of Brazil, MST, which, you know, is an organization of over 1 million peasant and landless people, that it's taken them 30 years to build their strength and their ideological strength, their mobilization strength, their organizational strength. And so even though things are dire, seeing them lead basically the re-election of Lula da Silva shows that the organization of people and their exercising of people's power, as we might call it, has the possibility, even though we're not saying that Lula is going to like flip the world upside down overnight, but our aim right now is to shift the correlation of forces and the balance of forces that would better equip our people's movements to further their agenda. So I think, of course, we're heading towards the 2-degree increase. So we might not have a planet in 5 years to defend and protect, but I do think that the interrelationship between, like, again, I'll use Brazil as an example, indigenous, women, you know, intellectuals, that has been a long process, maybe more than 3 decades in the making, but they're nonetheless are seeing a qualitative shift in how they're able to organize, even though it was by a small margin, but it's a better small margin than in previous years where the balance of forces has been like this. And we are constantly just defending ourselves on the basic thing. And in Africa, we're taking a lot of that inspiration and are hoping that we can organize more regionally, because, you know, people have been talking about multipolarity, like from unipolar to multipolar with the emergence of China. But we're starting to see that might not be the case. We might need to organize more regionally and create regional bulwarks that are actually more reflective of our ability to coordinate on a lower scale rather than an international scale.
Thank you, Mikaela.
Could I comment?
Yes.
Yeah, what you said about Lula is really fantastic. And what I think on the Europe scale is that the Russian sanctions, which are completely, totally crazy, and the blowing up of the Nord Stream, which was not Russia, I think this will lead to some kind of uprising in Europe, because already now there were 70,000 people in Prague saying that the sanctions must be stopped, we must have gas. And Italians are burning their electric bills outside banks. In the UK, there have been regularly thousands of people going to the streets because of the energy prices. So in a way, maybe the war is really bad. All wars are bad. We have never discussed the reasons for the war in Finland. We are absolutely totally in black on that issue. But I think that the sanctions might lead to that the people really see that the politicians do not represent their interests anymore. And that's this geopolitical crazy war between, in this case, it's a war between Russia and the US, and will continue with China, must be stopped. And if we don't do it, it is like you said, we might not have a planet in 3 or 5 years to fight for. But I think, I don't believe in Finland there will be no uprising, and not in Sweden, maybe more likely in Sweden. The Finns are very, very obedient, and we believe our politicians. When they say we go to NATO, we do. When they say we go to the EU, we do. But we have to put hope in the more brave and courageous and radical people in Europe. And there are also already in Germany, former eastern parts, people are taking the streets because they say, open up the gas line, put down the sanctions. And what they also said lately is that NATO doesn't give us welfare or security, neither nor. And when that is being realized, maybe there will be a change. And that is the hope we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulla. More comments? Yes.
Alika, thank you for your speech. That actually, for all of you who are speaking here, is actually the reason, because I came here because the speakers aren't quite telling what we should do somewhere. You are the experts, and your knowledge, you live in these countries, you know how everything works there. You're not anymore objects, and that's one of the big changes we have been seeing. It's not that what we can do for Africa, but what we can do together. And I think that is the work to the change. Of course, it troubles me that we are going to the NATO, I see, but at the same time we are looking for our security, and at the same time we are opening the door to Turkey to do whatever they want with the Kurds, and do exactly the same thing Russia does in Ukraine. So these kind of events are important. We need to talk, and we need to take the responsibility that we understand how our actions go around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to comment, Ulla or Mikaela? One more comment.
Thank you so much, Mikaela and Ulla, for helping me. I'm and I'm from Iran originally.
We have difficulties to hear. The microphone is somehow not good.
Would you like to come closer to the common problem? Yes, true. Okay. Or if you want to go here, the microphone is here, so please say, yeah, thank you.
I'm not really good in English, but I try my best. Thank you, Mikaela and Ulla, both of you. Thank you. And
Because you will be, okay.
you are welcome. Okay. It's better. Thank you so much. I am Bahar Muzaffari and I'm originally from Iran, and I live in Finland for 16 years. And you know about the situation of Iran at the moment, and I want to just say, especially to Mikaela, thank you for your presentation. It was very good. Listen you, and your presentation confirmed for me at least that we are in Iran in a right way. You know, revolution in Iran is started about more than 2 months ago, actually, and this is the first time in history that revolution is started with women issue, and it is very, very important that I think in this moment, many of women in Iran recognize that they have to fight against fundamentalism in Iran, and also fight against imperialism. If we want to get free, and I thought many times how, for example, my Finnish comrades and Finnish friends can support us. Maybe in this moment I don't have any solution, but maybe your support, and if you addresses solidarity with women could be best support at this moment. That's my comments. Thank you so much. And I would like ask you, Mikaela, especially, what do you think? What do you think about my speech? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Should I answer?
Yes, please. Go ahead, Mikaela.
Well, two things in relation to the first comment and the second is, and it relates to, I think, what Ulla was saying about maybe in Finland right now, the current conditions don't allow for the society to feel mobilized against NATO. But I think those who are interested in peace need to channel their energies in support of as you said, if it's Germany, if it's the Italians, and find ways to raise those struggles and amplify those struggles so that people see, wow, that whole country sees this as a negative. Maybe we should be reflecting. So that's one of the things. It's a general, tactic that's been done in, any revolution. You amplify the weakest chain, in the way that the Cubans supported Africans in Angola to defeat the apartheid regime in South Africa, etc. So that's one thing. The other is the fact that very few people know that Africa Command was created by NATO. So NATO said, we're struggling to create an independent monitoring system and surveillance and military control of North Africa. And it was the high commander of NATO who became the first commander of AFRICOM in 2007. So I think that's also an opportunity to link the struggles of the African continent and Europe, is that AFRICOM, which again is an imperialist police, not only of people's movements in terms of migration, but also as protecting the commercial interests of the US. And they have documents that say this very clearly about protecting the supply chain of mineral resources. They assist France in, 1 in 3 light bulbs in France is powered by 2 mines in Niger, where the Nigerian people only have 1 in 7 has access to electricity, but 1 in 3 light bulbs in France are powered by those uranium deposits. So I think we need to make those connections a bit more clear. And if we're supporting the Germans, for example, the AFRICOM base the headquarters doesn't exist on the African continent. It's in Stuttgart in Germany. So if we support the Germans who don't want the sanctions, we should also push against the NATO, or essentially AFRICOM base headquarters, in Stuttgart. Then in relation to your question, I didn't hear your name, from Iran. I think it's a very challenging situation, because when the Iranian revolution was emerging in the last few months, it reminded me a lot of the challenges we face in Africa. Because, for example, in South Africa, we have a very, very deeply unequal society where gender-based violence is 1 in 3 women in their lifetime are experiencing gender-based violence in some format. We have one of the highest youth unemployment is over 50%. Like half of the young people don't have jobs, don't have opportunities. So on the one hand, we live in a deeply, deeply unequal society that politically represses those who stand up against it. But we also have this contortion where we have to twist, because South Africa has been one of the countries that has said no to NATO, that has said no to US imperialism. So I think our organizations right now, even though it's such a challenge to challenge our state, but to be anti-imperialist, we've had to do a lot of education work with our movements to come to common understanding about what is a tactical position versus a broader strategic position. Like tactically, we had to support the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa, who's a terrible petite bourgeoisie capitalist aligned person, we had to say we support the principled position of South Africa against NATO efforts, but we still had to do the double back of saying, in this current context, not in the world where people deserve to have, humane living standards. So I don't have a good or simple answer, but I think that those who are organizing in Iran need to do so around understanding what's our tactical objective, what's our strategic objective, and what's our long-term goal, and differentiating how we manage those things. Otherwise, you'll find yourself in a purist or factionalist position where if you don't get the full revolution right now, then you think you're being a traitor, when in fact it comes in steps, it comes in zigzags, but everyone needs to understand what the organizational principle towards the tactic, the strategy, and the bigger outcome is.
Thank you, Mikaela. You did not see or hear, but there were small applause from Iran. some other comments or questions? Yes, if you would say, please come over here, so also the microphone will get your input. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I would like to say that we have a very big problem here in Finland. We get so little information from the countries in Africa. Media is not interested in Africa. Our government is not interested in Africa, what happens there. And that's a big problem for the common people who live in Finland. And you see, Africa has one very good thing. The population is young, and they can do so much, and we must trust that they do what they can. Thank you.
Thank you. Comments for this from Zoom or from here?
I mean, we have an extremely young continent. 19 years old is the average age. 19 is the average age of 1.4 billion people. So there's a lot of potential, but we who are, peace activists, progressive people who want equality, justice, etc., we are on a back foot because we're not working as fast as maybe, for example, a jihadist extremist group who recruit young people with, certain types of ideologies that sound really powerful. So we have a big task ahead of us to organize the types of leadership that can appeal to young people and bring young people's energies in, because a lot of them don't have opportunities to education, work, etc. So we have a big problem, but we're hoping, as I said, if we organize more regionally, we can create strongholds that have been historically successful. Like in Africa, we had frontline states such as Zambia, Tanzania, Ghana, that held the ideological and political line. But we need to find a way for Finland to get access to the information from Africa as well.
A comment, please. We can come closer. If you feel shy, you don't have to come up here, but just closer for the microphone. Thank you.
Yes, Manusari, and you were so right about the information, and the quality of the information that keeps us thinking that people are objects. It's of course it's important that we know about the conflicts and everything, but the average image for people are that Africa is behind us. But what we also need to know is about the innovations. They have greater cities in some places in Africa that we have in Europe. They are more growing. The economy is one of the fastest growing in the whole world. And of course, it gives problems like China is buying a lot of parts of Africa. And that is a big problem. So we need to know also this, not just that where there is feminine, we need to know where the people work hard, where economy is growing, and we need to know there is, I think it's Kenya that is one of the countries that actually said no to plastic bags. So all of these things we should also know. And the things in South Africa, you talked about gender violence, but it's also one of the first countries that has recognized LGBT rights in law, not in action yet, but in law. And these things we should know here too. Not only if you're interested, then you have to dig it, but it should be public all over. Thank you.
Thank you. Comment for this from Zoom or here?
Oh, here, sorry. I have a small comment, but it's part of a longer conversation that I've been working in. Is the question of China in Africa is also a hot topic, and I also think that there's a popular misaggregation of the role of China in Africa, because again, tactically, China has enabled a lot of African countries, such as Ethiopia, such as Kenya, to get certain forms of like infrastructure. For example, there's like the railway line between Ethiopia and Djibouti. There's also the railway line historically between Zambia and Tanzania that has allowed for some level of what we would call development, that again is not a revolutionary development, but allows Africa to have different options. So my big work that I work with right now is I do have a podcast called The Crane, a China-Africa podcast, and I do work with people around understanding. We're not saying China is the model to follow. We're not saying that they are, you know, above everyone else, but the forms of, for example, loans that have been given are totally different from the IMF loans we've historically received. As an example, the loans we get from China are lower interest rates, have longer maturing periods, have materially seen hospitals come up, roads come up, bridges come up, power stations, hydroelectric, etc. And it's not to say that it's without limitations, without problems, but we have for the last 300 years only had one option, Western colonialists. And now with the rise of China, we've at least been given space to be able to leverage and fight for our interests on not on our own terms, but on better terms than in previous decades. So even though there are limits to China, the Western countries still have the most land ownership in Africa. The multinationals still have the most land ownership in Africa than any other nation. The World Bank, IMF, Paris Agreement, they still have the biggest loans and debt to Africa than China. So there is, I think, still a Western propaganda that disallows us to understand the nuance and, again, the tactic versus the bigger strategy. And ultimately, I was in Senegal in 2021 in November for the Forum on China Africa. And what was so shocking for me was the fact that of all the 54 countries that were represented in the Forum on China Africa, there was not a collective form of negotiation and bargaining coming from the African side. So China says, here's our proposal. And most African leaders are just like, fine, cool. But there is not the sense of how do we project our agenda so that we're getting the most out of this, so that it benefits our people. But we have the problem of we need to wrangle and strangle our own governments to represent our own interests. And so I don't think the China is the enemy is a useful lens to look at it. I think we understand the limitations, but we know that we've been given more space than we have in the last 100 years.
Thank you, Mikaela. Was Ulla or Johanna first by raising their Zoom hand?
Ulla.
Okay, so Ulla, there you go.
Yeah, Mikaela, since here in Finland also China is the new Russophobia, it's now Chinaphobia. I would be really, really, really happy to get your arguments about infrastructure and hospitals and so on and cheap loans in comparison to the World Bank and to Western loans. If you have some kind of document, anything, we will take it with absolute gratitude. So we can use it in our arguments. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ulla. Do you want to quickly comment, Mikaela, and then I will give Johanna?
It was somebody else.
I can send materials. I can share materials with Leah, and then you can share it, because it's not an easy argument to make, sadly, because the world is more complicated. But if we split it into black and white, we are losing a lot of the complexity.
Okay, thank you, Mikaela, and then Johanna.
Yes, and good morning, and maybe say hello from Africa. I'm currently in Kenya, but I am the Finnish representative to Somalia. And I wanted to actually, thank you, Mikaela, for your very expressive presentation Very good. I have to keep the camera most of the time closed because we have a lot of electricity cuts because of the rains. I wanted to comment, but I don't know if I heard right. There was a comment that Finland is not interested in Africa. This definitely doesn't apply, I don't think, to the current government, because our expansion in the, let's say, diplomatic presence and the companies, individuals, NGOs, I see it here a lot in Kenya, but I see it also in Somalia. I've been in this position, I've been in Africa before, based in Africa before, but I have seen incredible increase, the amount of NGOs, and it is so, especially in relation to Somalia, Kenya is in a way natural, because this is a fairly stable country and this is in a totally different world than Somalia currently. But the amount of people that have visited already within a year has been incredible. So after the Africa strategy of the government was approved, I think the idea of more of a partnership relation with different African countries has increased. I think it still has a lot, we have a lot to work on, but it is not something I saw 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so in that sense, I'm very happy about that. Also that we started to expand, that we have people in pretty much in all the African countries. You might be under a certain embassy, but you are, like I am in Somalia. This is the first time that we have a resident person in Mogadishu. We have premises, and so in that sense, we have expanded our presence quite drastically. And so I personally, I think there is a lot of interest in Africa, and is maybe in general the population is still, but the thing is that because Africa is so many countries, it's not about continent. I mean, there is a day and night difference between Kenya and Somalia. So it's not that you can like say that, okay, you are not interested in the whole continent. I mean, we all have our different connections to different countries. And I think the diversity of the continent is something that really fascinates, and the complexity of that. And when we were talking about, yes, I think the good news don't fly a lot from different African countries to Europe. I don't think good news at the moment in the media anyway fly very well. But, and that is, of course, thinking even Kenya now, yes, plastic bags are not allowed. They even say it in the aeroplane when you land to Nairobi. But then also the different innovations with the mobile phone. Basically here in Kenya, I can operate fully with my mobile phone. And the same applies to Somalia. Somalia is a country, in a good and bad, that has the highest usage of Twitter. So a lot of politics is done there. Unfortunately, a lot of war narrative is also done there. That is not even, most of those stories are not true. But still, I think but it's all about also correspondence, that if you go and you look at now the foreign ministries, Africa, from different embassies, the news, I mean, we try to get rid of that old patronizing, and I wouldn't say that from this embassy, a single of those articles have left, but it is still the big media that has a bit complication with that. And it depends also on the quality of the correspondence that are sent here. If they still see Africa or different African countries in 1990, But also there are certain realities that one has to give as news. I mean, Somalia is heading to famine, and that is something I think we have to tell the world. Because in this competition for resources, it is possibly heading to the worst famine it has ever experienced. But to make that news is impossible because Ukraine is dominating now the agenda, and everybody is just waiting for the declaration of famine. But it's so difficult because it's a country where you, in order to get that data to meet that technical definition of famine, it's very difficult because Al-Shabaab dominates, let's say, 25% of the area. And but that is one reality in one country. But I would say differently that I think Finland has a lot of interest, and it is changing the image that possibly let's say the average population feels, but it's changing very slowly. But I wonder what is the image of Latin America, because if you read any Finnish newspapers, you basically get news of nothing else than Europe. Okay, this is long from here. I'm mute now.
Thank you, Johanna. I am looking at the time, and there's you can quickly comment. If Ulla and Mikaela, you have a comment. Who was first to notice? Okay.
Okay, first of all, I would like to ask Johanna, you said you are present now in Africa, but could you give like 5 bright examples of what presence mean? What are you practically doing? How many hospitals, how many schools, how many girls not forced to be married, or such practical things? And I think that mentioning the mobile phone, I would ask Mikaela, how many persons in Africa can afford to have a mobile phone? So I don't think mobile phone is a very great example of advancement in a world when they can't afford it. But I would like to hear the 5 examples of what you practically, from your point of view now where you are sitting, what is done now practically. Thank you.
And time-wise, we can make it brief because the next conversation is awaiting. So.
Well,
you want to go, Johanna, or should I?
I don't know what is the order.
Can I go, because I can make a contribution and then answer what Ulla was saying and then say goodbye? Is one, Ulla, in terms of what you said about the phones, again, interestingly enough, the cheapest phones right now that a lot of Africans, especially in Kenya, East Africa, are using is coming from techno, from the Chinese ones, because they have features such as, you know, in Ethiopia, they have Amharic, the language, on the phone. It's half the price, a third of the price of what the US, Japanese phones are costing. It has things like double SIM cards, because in Africa, you normally have 2 SIM cards so you can access different networks that are much cheaper, etc. So because of that kind of aspect of China, people are having more access. But of course, we know the underhand of it is that the main components to cell phones are coming from the exploitation of African workers. But you still can't tell African people, because of that, they are not allowed to have phones, whilst the rest of the world gets to have phones. So it's a complicated thing. But then in relation to what Joanna was saying, and I think my final remarks is that even though, and maybe Finland has increased, I know like Sweden, I'm a product of foreign diplomacy because my father worked for SIDA, for the Swedish Foreign Ministry, and Danida, and that's how he met my mother in Zimbabwe and how I came to be a human being. But the question is not necessarily of, we should ask ourselves, is there engagement and has there been increase, but what form of diplomacy has been practiced? Like, as you said, concretely, what are the outcomes of that diplomacy? Because right now we are sitting in a hotbed where we might have statements, we might have, you know, Sweden is doing empowerment this, empowerment that, but there's no kind of concrete support for organizations that in Africa are trying to lead a progressive agenda. And maybe now is not as was, you know, in the national liberation, you know, we had Olof Palme was supporting us, was supporting the national liberation groups. That really helped us to define the agenda more clearly. Now it's a bit more murky. But for example, the Swedish Foreign Embassy, one of the useful things they're doing, which is maybe going to change because of the new government of the right, is that the Swedish embassy has supported the shack dwellers movement, for example, who have been politically persecuted. I mentioned the woman who was killed this year. She was one of 3 of the leaders who's been killed in the last 7 months. And the Swedish embassy has really pushed to say this is a human rights crisis, and has used their position in international relations to affirm a local domestic struggle. So that is the kind of diplomacy that we find useful, even though we know it has limits. So it's about the quality also, not necessarily the quantity of what I think the foreign actors are doing in our country. But thank you so much for the conversation, for the questions. You can have my email if there's anyone who wants to contact me. I've sent it in the chat, but I think Leah can also share it. So I'll hand over to Johanna to answer as well. But thank you so much, everyone, for your very, very helpful and thoughtful comments.
Thank you very much, Mikaela.
Thank you, Mikaela. No, just quickly I will then explain in my own contribution more detail what we are currently doing. I'm not personally working in Kenya. This is where I come for rest and recuperation because Somalia is a conflict country. So what we do is we provide funding to many of the basic services. If I give examples, in Mogadishu, Finland is the first country to finance blood bank. Then we finance the intensive care units for infants, basic schooling that have in overall Somalia, but the last school I've been to is in Mogadishu, with school food is a problematic item also. But yes, the one concrete, of course, we give humanitarian assistance, and I'm just coming from Baidoa, possibly having cholera, and we have increased from 1 million to at the moment 13 million annual for humanitarian assistance to try to prevent this escalation of malnutrition. However, that is not in our hands. I mean, it needs more than that. But Somalia is the second biggest country program what Finland is financing, and it includes many NGOs. But I will touch this topic otherwise it will get too long. But concrete, yes, you talk to a person that has served in Afghanistan before this, and before that in Yemen, and before that I have a career in the UN. I think I know pretty much what happens out there.